Ethan Cole dragged the back of his canvas glove across his forehead, smearing a mixture of sawdust and sweat into his brow. He was 62 years old, a retired structural engineer from Seattle, and entirely out of his depth. When his wife, Diane, passed away from pancreatic cancer 18 months prior, Ethan found himself living in a house that was altogether too quiet. The walls seemed to echo with conversations they would never finish. Desperate to escape the suffocating silence of his grief, he sold the suburban home, packed his tools, and drove east into the dense, rain-soaked forests of the Oregon Cascades. He purchased an abandoned, decaying property on the outskirts of Oakhaven, a logging town whose best years had died sometime in the late 80s. The property came cheap, mostly because it had sat rotting since 1994. It was built by a man named Thomas Fletcher, a notoriously reclusive logger who had died of a heart attack, leaving the property to rot. Ethan didn't care about the cabin's history. He cared that its roof was caved in, its floorboards were warped, and it required a punishing amount of physical labor to fix. Exhaustion was the only remedy Ethan had found for his insomnia. If his muscles ached badly enough, his brain couldn't dwell on Diane. Months blurred into a relentless routine of hauling lumber, tearing out dry rot, and replacing rusted galvanized pipes. By late October, the cabin was actually beginning to look like a home. The cedar siding was patched, the stone fireplace was repointed, and the windows no longer rattled in the relentless autumn winds. However, one major structural issue remained. The foundation beneath the kitchen was sagging, causing a sharp, sickening slope in the floorboards. Ethan knew he had to get under the house. The crawlspace was accessible only through an old storm cellar hatch around the back. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight, a trenching shovel, and hydraulic jacks, Ethan descended into the claustrophobic dark. The air down there smelled aggressively of damp earth, mildew, and decades of undisturbed dust. As he maneuvered the first hydraulic jack into position beneath the central load-bearing beam, he realized the dirt footing was too soft. He needed to dig down a few feet to lay a concrete pad, or the jack would simply sink into the mud under the weight of the house. He knelt on the cold ground and began to dig. The trenching shovel bit into the loamy soil easily at first. He scooped away shovelful after shovelful, tossing the dirt behind him. But about 2 feet down, the steel blade struck something solid with a dull, metallic thud. Ethan paused. He scraped away the loose dirt with his gloved hands, expecting to find an old septic pipe or a buried stone. Instead, his fingers brushed against cold, rusted iron. It was flat, rigid, and entirely unnatural. Curiosity overriding his fatigue, Ethan dug faster, widened the hole. 10 minutes later, he leveraged the edge of the shovel beneath the object and heaved. A heavy rectangular lockbox came free from the earth. It was roughly the size of a large tackle box, heavily corroded and sealed with a heavy brass padlock that had fused shut with decades of rust. Ethan dragged the heavy box out of the crawlspace, hauling it up into the fading afternoon light of the backyard. He sat it on his makeshift sawhorses. It didn't look like buried treasure. It looked like a secret. Using a pair of bolt cutters, Ethan snapped the rusted padlock. It gave way with a sharp crack. He pried the lid open. Inside, the box was lined with oilcloth, which had preserved the contents remarkably well against the damp Oregon earth. There were no gold coins, no stashes of Prohibition-era cash. Instead, Ethan found 3 items: a tarnished silver locket, a thick, leather-bound ledger, and a stack of Polaroid photographs wrapped in a dry-cleaning bag. Ethan picked up the locket first. He popped the delicate clasp. Inside was a black-and-white photograph of a young woman with dark hair and a bright, unmistakable smile. Engraved on the inside of the silver casing were the initials M.H. Next, he unwrapped the Polaroids. His breath caught in his throat. The photos were dark, underlit by a cheap camera flash, but the subject was painfully clear. It was the same woman from the locket, but she wasn't smiling. She was bound to a wooden chair in what looked like a basement, her face bruised, her eyes wide with absolute terror. The background in the photos, a distinctive stone wall with a crack running through it like a lightning bolt, made Ethan's stomach drop. He recognized that wall. It was the interior of his own storm cellar. Hands trembling, Ethan opened the leather ledger. The pages were filled with meticulously recorded dates and financial sums dating back to the late 1970s. But it wasn't a business ledger. It was a record of extortion. August 14, 1982, cash withdrawal, $500, given to BH. To misplace the vehicle. October 3, 1982, cash withdrawal, $1,000. BH. Secured the county file. March 12, 1983, payment to BH. Routine silence fee, $500. The payments continued, monthly stopping abruptly in November 1994, the month Thomas Fletcher died. Ethan slammed the book shut. The cabin, once his sanctuary of healing, suddenly felt like a tomb. He was sitting on top of a crime scene. A violent, horrific secret that had been buried in the mud while the man responsible lived out his days in peace. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his armchair, a loaded Remington shotgun resting across his lap, staring at the box on his kitchen table. By sunrise, Ethan knew he couldn't just hand this over to the local police. Not until he knew who BH was. He drove his truck into Oak Haven, the morning fog clinging tightly to the pine trees. His first stop was the Oak Haven Public Library. He found the local archives section, a dusty corner overseen by an elderly woman named Beatrice Warren. "I'm looking for old newspapers," Ethan told her, keeping his voice steady. Specifically, anything regarding missing persons in this county around 1982. Beatrice peered at him over her reading glasses, her eyes narrowing. 1982? You don't need a newspaper for that, Mr. Cole. Anyone who lived here back then knows what happened in the summer of '82. Who went missing? Ethan asked. Margaret Hayes, Beatrice said softly, glancing around the empty library as if speaking the name aloud might summon a ghost. She was 22, worked at the diner on Main Street. One night she locked up, walked out to her car, and vanished into thin air. State troopers scoured the woods for months. Never found her car. Emmett Eaton's blood ran cold. Who was the lead investigator on the case locally? That would be Sheriff Boyd Hastings, Beatrice replied. Well, he was just a deputy back then. Young, ambitious. He took over the department in the late '80s. Still running it today. BH. Ethan thanked Beatrice, his mind racing as he walked back to his truck. Sheriff Boyd Hastings, the man who had welcomed Ethan to the county with a firm handshake and a fake smile just 6 months ago. The man who had been paid thousands of dollars over a decade by Thomas Fletcher to look the other way, to misplace a vehicle, to lose a file. Ethan had intended to go straight to the state police headquarters in Portland, bypassing the local authorities entirely. But as he turned his key in the ignition, he noticed a squad car parked across the street, idling in front of the hardware store. Behind the wheel sat Sheriff Boyd Hastings, his aviator sunglasses fixed squarely on Ethan's truck. A cold spike of paranoia drove itself into Ethan's spine. He pulled out at the parking space and headed back toward the cabin. He needed to get the lockbox, secure the evidence, and drive straight to Portland. By the time he reached the dirt road leading to his property, the sky had bruised into a dark, violent purple. An early winter storm was rolling off the mountains, bringing sheets of freezing rain. Ethan parked his truck and rushed inside, his boots tracking mud across his newly finished floorboards. He grabbed a waterproof duffel bag from his bedroom and hurried to the kitchen table to pack the lockbox. He froze. The table was empty. Ethan spun around. The cabin was exactly as he had left it, except the lockbox was gone. Panic clawed at his throat. He reached for his shotgun, but before his fingers could brush the cold steel of the barrel, a heavy voice echoed from the hallway. "You've done a hell of a job at this place, Ethan." Thomas would be impressed. Sheriff Boyd Hastings stepped out of the shadows of the hallway. He wasn't wearing his uniform jacket. In one hand, he held the rusted lockbox. In the other, his service pistol was drawn, pointed directly at Ethan's chest. "How did you get in here?" Ethan demanded. forcing his voice to remain steady despite the violent hammering of his heart. "You fixed the front door, but you didn't change the locks on the cellar hatch," Boyd said, his voice smooth, devoid of any remorse. "I saw you at the library. I knew Beatrice would talk. She always talks, so I figured I'd let myself in and see what you dug up." Boyd glanced down at the box. "Thomas was a sloppy drunk, but I never thought he was stupid enough to keep a receipt book for a murder." "You helped him cover it up," Ethan said, taking a slow, microscopic step toward the kitchen counter, where a heavy framing hammer lay. "I was 24 years old, Ethan. Thomas had money, and he had leverage. He killed Margaret because she turned him down. It was a crime of passion, stupid and messy. By the time I found out, she was already gone. I just cleaned up the mess, and I built a good life for myself with the money he paid me." Boyd cocked the hammer of his pistol. The metallic click was deafening over the sound of the rain lashing against the windows. "I'm retiring next year, Ethan. I have a pension. I have grandchildren. I am not going to let a depressed widower playing amateur carpenter ruin my life over a dead girl from 40 years ago. If you shoot me, the state police will tear this town apart," Ethan warned. "No, they won't," Boyd smiled grimly. "They'll find a grieving husband who couldn't handle the anniversary of his wife's death. It's tragic, really. Tragic, but believable." Boyd raised the weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. Bang! The gunshot shattered the roar of the storm. Ethan flinched, closing his eyes, bracing for the impact. But the pain never came. Instead, Sheriff Boyd Hastings gasped, a wet, rattling sound. The pistol slipped from his fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor. Boyd staggered forward, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing face first onto the ground. Standing in the open doorway behind him, soaked to the bone and shivering violently, was an old man holding a smoking, double-barreled hunting rifle. It was Silas Fletcher, Thomas's younger brother. Silas lowered the rifle, his weathered face pale and drawn. He looked at Boyd's body, then up at Ethan. "I saw him follow you," Silas wheezed, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I've watched this property since my brother died. I knew the box was down there. I knew what Thomas did." Ethan stood frozen, staring at the old man. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Tears mixed with the rain on Silas's wrinkled cheeks. "Because Boyd was the police. Thomas told me everything before he died. He bragged about it, and he told me if I ever said a word, Boyd would frame me for it. I've lived with the ghost of Margaret Hayes for 40 years, Ethan. I couldn't let him kill you too. But," Silas walked over to the armchair, sitting down heavily, dropping the rifle to the floor. He looked incredibly tired, as if the weight of 4 decades had suddenly crushed his spine. "Call the state troopers, Mr. Cole. Tell them I shot the sheriff, and tell them to dig up the southeast corner of the cellar. That's where Thomas buried her." The aftermath was a blur of flashing red and blue lights, yellow crime scene tape, and relentless questioning. State police investigators swarmed the property. They found Margaret Hayes exactly where Silas said she would be, her remains tangled in the roots of the old pine trees that pressed against the foundation. Silas Fletcher pleaded guilty to manslaughter, though a sympathetic judge, taking into account his advanced age and his role in exposing a corrupt official, sentenced him to house arrest. The town of Oakhaven was turned upside down. The legacy of Sheriff Boyd Hastings was systematically dismantled, his name removed from the town hall, his past cases reopened and scrutinized. Margaret Hayes was finally given a proper burial. Her surviving family, an older sister living in Idaho, drove out for the service. Ethan attended, standing quietly in the back of the cemetery. When the sister approached him after the service, she simply hugged him, weeping in silence. It was a profound, heavy moment, the closing of a wound that had bled poison into the town for decades. A year later, Ethan sat on the back porch of his fully restored cabin. The foundation was solid now, poured with thick, reinforced concrete. The house no longer sagged. The forest around him was quiet, save for the wind rustling through the hemlock trees. He poured a cup of coffee and watched the sunrise paint the Oregon sky in strokes of gold and crimson. The cabin had not cured his grief over Diane, he knew, now that nothing truly would, but it had given him something else. It had given him a purpose. He had stepped into the dark to fix a broken house, and in doing so, he had fixed a broken past. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan Cole took a deep breath of the morning air and felt completely at peace.